Today, we're diving into one of the most powerful and, let's be honest, controversial institutions in history, the medieval Inquisition. Was it a system of justice, or was it a reign of terror? Well, that's what we're here to figure out.
So let me ask you something. Imagine a world where it's not just your actions that could get you into trouble, but your thoughts, your beliefs. That's the core idea we're going to unpack, and it gets right to the heart of what the Inquisition was all about. So here's how we're going to break it all down. First up, we'll cover what the Inquisition even was and why it got started. Then we'll look at how an investigation actually played out. After that, we'll get into the specifics of crime and punishment. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at its long-term impact. All right, to really get a handle on the Inquisition, you kind of have to travel back in time, into the world it was born into. So let's start with the basics, the what and the why. So what was the Inquisition? Put simply, it was a special court system. It was set up by the Catholic Church, officially by Pope Gregory IX, way back in 1231. And its whole job was to find and deal with people who held beliefs that went against the official teachings of the Church. But why? Why create this whole system? Well, you have to understand the big fear at the time was something called heresy. Church leaders saw it as a kind of dangerous disease. They believed that if these wrong beliefs were allowed to spread, they could infect the entire community and basically tear society apart. For them, everyone believing the same thing was the glue holding their world together.
So who were the people actually running these courts? Think of them as a kind of special task force. The Inquisitors were super educated monks, usually from two specific groups, the Dominicans and the Franciscans. These guys were experts in religious law. They answered directly to the Pope, not to local kings, and they could travel anywhere to conduct their investigations.
Okay, so now we've got the what and the why, but how did it all actually work in practice? It's time to open up the Inquisitor's playbook and see the step-by-step process.
So it usually followed a pretty clear pattern. First, an inquisitor would arrive in a town and give a big public speech about the dangers of heresy. Then he denounced something called a period of grace. This was basically a 1-month window where people could come forward and confess on their own to get a much lighter punishment. After that month, the secret investigation began. And finally, if you were accused, you'd be brought to a trial, where the inquisitor was both the person prosecuting you and the judge. And this is where it got really, really difficult if you were the one on trial. For one thing, you were never told who pointed the finger at you. That made it almost impossible to defend yourself against personal enemies. And on top of that, you didn't get a lawyer. It was basically just you, alone, facing this expert judge who was also in charge of the case against you.
You know, the key thing to remember here is that the whole system was built for one main purpose: to get a confession. A confession was seen as the absolute best piece of evidence. The trial wasn't really about finding out if you were innocent. It was about getting you to admit you were guilty.
So that leads us right into our next section, crime and punishment. What exactly was this crime they were looking for? And if you were found guilty, what happened then?
The number one crime, as we said, was heresy. But what does that even mean? It wasn't just about getting a religious fact wrong. Heresy was defined as knowing a core belief of the church and then stubbornly choosing to deny it. It was seen as a deliberate choice, an act of rebellion. The punishments really depended on how serious the offense was. You can think of it like a ladder. At the bottom, for a minor mistake, especially if you confessed, you might just have to do some public penance, like fasting or going on a pilgrimage. A step up, you might be forced to wear a yellow cross on your clothes as a mark of shame. For more serious stuff, you could get prison time. And at the very top of the ladder, for someone who refused to change their mind or who went back to heresy, well, that was the most severe outcome. And yes, we have to talk about torture. In 1252, it was officially authorized, but it was supposed to be a last resort, only used to get a confession when there was already a lot of evidence. Now, there were rules. It wasn't supposed to kill you or leave you permanently injured. But you can imagine, just the fear of it was often enough to make someone confess, whether they were guilty or not.
Now, we often picture the Inquisition as just constant burnings at the stake. And while that absolutely did happen, it's important to know that it wasn't the most common outcome. The church itself didn't actually execute anyone. Instead, if someone was found to be an unrepentant heretic, they were handed over to the local government to be punished. And in the grand scheme of things, only a small percentage of all the people who went on trial were actually executed. So after all of that, what was the long-term impact?
let's dive into our final section and explore the Inquisition's legacy and how it really did change the world. Here's something you might find surprising. If you compare the Inquisition's courts to the other local courts of the time, they were actually more organized in some ways. Local courts were often run by lords who were biased or used superstitious methods to decide guilt. The Inquisition, on the other hand, had educated judges, a set of legal rules, and they kept detailed written records of everything. The big difference, of course, was that it focused on what you believed. But the impact on day-to-day life was huge. The ever-present threat of being accused of heresy created this culture of fear and caution. People became really careful about what they said, especially about new or different ideas. This had a chilling effect, not just on religion, but on science and philosophy too, as thinkers worried their work could get them into serious trouble. And all of this leaves us with a massive question, one that is just as important today as it was 800 years ago. The Inquisition was an attempt to protect what they saw as essential community values, but it came at a huge cost to individual freedom. So, how do we, in any society, find the right balance between protecting the community and protecting an individual's freedom to believe what they want? It's a tough one, and it's definitely something worth thinking about. Thanks for joining me for this Explain.